I was thinking about this in terms of veganism and vegetarianism. I think part of the reason that people are so guilty about what they eat now is because they don't sacrifice it to a sufficiently high purpose. And you might say, well, why should an animal die so that I should live? And that's actually a real question.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's a question that everybody has to answer or feel profoundly disturbed in their unconscious orientation and then suffering as a consequence of it. And so if it's not consecrated, if what you're sacrificing that's alive isn't consecrated to something like a transcendent, the highest possible transcendent aim, then there's no justification in taking the blood.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm nervous about that conceptualization to some degree because it sounds like a ends justify the means argument, but
it's important. But in terms, I mean, I don't know about the veganism question, but in terms of understanding sacrifice, it's important to see what happens. And one of the things that, let's say, the meeting of Athens and Jerusalem does in the foundation of Christianity is to reveal the notion that the best sacrifice is giving yourself.
Yeah.
That's the best sacrifice. So you can think about it, right? In a family, you can have a scapegoat. It works, right? If you have a family of 5, you can have one of the kids who's always the one doing the wrong thing. You blame everything on that person, and it actually binds you together. Like if you find someone to, like, a group of young boys find the one boy that gets picked on.
Yeah.
And that works. It binds the group together, but it's not the best way to bind. And what seems to be revealed...
It's because all the sin is externalized.
That's right. And it seems like the idea of saying, no, I give myself to this group. Yeah. That's the best, that seems to be the highest sacrifice.
Well, I think what we saw today, so with the stations of the Via Dolorosa, the stations of the cross, what you see when people act that out and contemplate it is a journey through the realms of human suffering. And so then the question might be, well, why would you do that? Or why should you do that even? And then why would that be a uniting phenomenon?
That's right.
And so you should do it from the psychological perspective because it appears that the best way to put the best foot forward is to voluntarily confront those things that you're afraid of and that disgust you, that stand in your way. And a century of clinical endeavor has culminated in that as, I would say, a universal axiom of successful psychotherapy. It's voluntary exposure.
Yeah.
It has to be voluntary exposure, augmented by voluntary attention. So the more intense the attention, the more real the encounter with that which is feared and avoided, the more curative the result, quite counterintuitively. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, fundamentally, is that there's no difference between that and learning. I'm taking 4 of my esteemed colleagues and you across the world. Oh, wow, this is amazing. To rediscover the ways our ancient ancestors developed the ideas that shaped modern society.
It was a monument to civic greatness.
To visit the places where history was made.
That is ash from the actual fires when the Babylonians burned Jerusalem from 2,500 years ago.
To walk the same roads.
We are following the path of the crucifixion.
And experience the same wonder.
We are on the site of a miracle.
What kind of resources can human beings bring to a mysterious but knowable universe?
Science, art, politics, all that makes life wonderful.
And something new about the world is revealed.
When you learn, what you do is you put yourself on the border of order and chaos, and this has all been mapped out quite nicely now neurophysiologically. The order is the conceptual scheme that you're already using to bind the world, and the chaos is everything that exists beyond that conceptual scheme, which would include to some degree the future, because the future has this novel element, because the future is not encapsulated yet in the conceptual scheme and can't be, because it's technically
still potential.
Yes, and it's not a deterministic potential either, at least not entirely.
Yeah.
And so what you do when you learn is you put yourself on the edge optimally, and then you incorporate something new, like a new fruit, and you let something that's not sufficiently not sufficiently appropriate, die as a consequence. And so in that sense, learning means you have to sacrifice your ignorance and your pride in an optimized manner. And if you do that properly, then it's actually enjoyable. It's engaging and meaningful and playful and all those things. And there's a deep instinct that signifies that. But it's a sacrificial act because you have to let the elements of yourself, which are really like sub-personalities, these functional conceptions, you have to let them die. And there's some pain associated with that. And that's part of the process of optimizing death on the psychological and psychophysiological front, so that you stay healthy and adapted, and so that you don't actually die by acting out your mistakes. Yeah. And so that idea of so that would be like the sacrifice of sin.
So there are two sacrifices, right? So in the Jewish tradition, at Yom Kippur, there are two sacrifices, and this is actually, I think I've been thinking about this in terms of understanding the problem of coherence, even whether it's in your person, or whether it's a conceptual category, or whether it is a society. There is a realizing that which doesn't fit, and then kind of pushing it out. That's the scapegoat sacrifice. Mm-hmm. So during Yom Kippur, they would take a goat and they would put the sins of other people on the goat. Mm-hmm. They would chase it out into the desert for it to die. It was given to a demon.
Right. That's to obliterate the anomalous.
Yeah.
Right. Rather than to incorporate it.
And then there was another sacrifice, which another goat was taken and then was given up to God. And then that was the sacrifice up. So you can imagine that if you're part of a basketball team, you have to give yourself up to the purpose of the basketball team, and you also have to eliminate the behavior that doesn't fit.
Yeah, and then you could also imagine, using the basketball analogy, think about that. Think about the game as the what would you call it? It's a fractal form of civilization, a game.
Yeah.
Okay, so the rules of the game aren't there to constrain, they're there to enable.
Yeah.
Now you have to abide by the rules, but the reason for that is the game can't continue without the rules. It's not so that you're constrained. It's actually so that you're freed to play the game. Okay, so then you might say, what principle should you abide by while you're playing the game? And the principle might be, crush your opponent. And then you might ask, well, who's your opponent? And one could be the other team. The other could be, well, also your own teammates, because you want to be the star player.
The best.
And then you might say, well, and what kind of margin of victory do you want to win by? And you might say, well, the largest possible margin of victory. So what you do is you go out as an absolute narcissist. You never pass the ball once. You play people who can't play basketball at all.
Yeah.
So you demolish them. You never pass to your teammates, and you score all the baskets. It's like victory, right? Well, in some sense, that is the ultimate local victory. If you constrain the game to a single exemplar, it's like, well, you're the best player on the team, and your team crushed your opponents, victory. But then the problem with that conception is that if you're on a basketball team, you don't play a basketball game. You play a whole sequence of basketball games, and you play them with a whole variety of opponents. And the ethos that has to emerge to allow the game to continue, if it iterates across locations, is not the same game that emerges if you only play it once. Mm-hmm. And that's probably another example of that stacking of centers. So you could say, well, imagine each game, there's a pattern that would enable you to win each game. And to some degree, merely playing for power would enable you to win some. But if you calculate it across a huge set of games, power, it would be some other principle that would arise, which would be something like the principle of voluntary free play is really what it is. It's the antithesis of power, the principle of voluntary free play. And then you'd say, well, your opponent, if you pick the right opponent, then that person is very tightly matched against you. Right. They're almost exactly at your skill level. And the reason for that is because if they're almost exactly at your skill level, they push you into optimal transformation while you're playing, because you have to extend your skill while you're attempting to win. And that's something like that ethos of reciprocity, is the extension of skill. Maybe it's only that while you're attempting to win. I mean, when we're having this conversation, there's no real personal victory in it if we're doing it right.
Yeah.
Right? It's only an extension of skill.
Yeah, and it's the hope that something more will emerge. Something
Well, that's
higher
the
will
victory.
emerge. Yeah, that's the victory. Yeah, and so this idea of sacrificing that which is outside and sacrificing up. Once you see that, you'll understand that the story that we saw today, like the story of Christ, it's both of them at the same time. So Jesus, that's why the story of Jesus is so hard to understand. One of the reasons, there's so many. One of the reasons why it's so hard to understand is because he's both sacrifices, you could say. So he's both, it's that which goes up, the king, the prophet, the son of God, the son of man, but he's also that which is excluded, which is outside the city, which is, the criminal that is murdered. All of these things get collapsed into one super duper condensed image. And it becomes the center, you could say.